In the spring of 2019, every cattle producer in Saline County, Missouri, ran their stocker calves the same way. They bought them light, put them on grass, dewormed them in the chute on arrival, and dewormed them again in the fall before the sale barn. This was not a decision, it was gravity. It was the shape of the floor beneath everyone's feet, and nobody thought to question the floor because the floor had always been there, and the cattle had always stood on it, and the money had mostly come in at the end of the year, which was proof enough that the floor was solid. Let me tell you about Saline County, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened there. Saline County sits in the middle of Missouri, west of the Missouri River, in a stretch of country that rolls just enough to fool you into thinking it isn't flat. The farms there are not small. 1,000 acres is a working unit. 2,000 is respectable. The grass grows thick from April through October, and the black soil underneath it is some of the best cattle country between Kansas City and St. Louis. The men who farmed it knew that. Their fathers had known it. Their grandfathers had built the fences and dug the ponds and established the rotations, and there was a quiet pride in that continuity that ran deeper than any balance sheet. The Lindgren family had been in Saline County since 1947, when Niels Lindgren came down from Fillmore County, Minnesota, with a young wife, a used truck, and enough money to put a down payment on 640 acres southeast of Marshall. He ran Angus cattle and a small hog operation, and he was methodical and careful and never spent money he didn't have. His son, Eric, added 400 acres in 1978 and dropped the hogs when the prices broke and focused entirely on grass-fed stockers, which was what the land wanted anyway. Eric Lindgren was a good farmer in the way that Saline County defined a good farmer. Consistent, unhurried, unimpressed by novelty, and deeply suspicious of anyone who came to him with a better idea. He dewormed his cattle in the chute with ivermectin because that was what you did, and the cattle gained weight, and he sold them in October, and the cycle continued. His daughter Ingrid was born in 1997, the third of 4 children, and she grew up doing what farm children do, moving cattle, fixing fence, riding in the cab of the tractor, learning the rhythms of the land by living inside them. She was quiet and observant in the way that middle children sometimes are, the kind of person who watches a thing happen 3 times before she says anything about it. She went to the University of Missouri in 2015 to study animal science, and that is where the story really begins, though nobody in Saline County would have said so at the time. Let me tell you about what Ingrid found at Missouri, because it matters more than anyone gave it credit for. In her second year, she took a parasitology course taught by a professor named Dr. Carol Hennessy, a woman who had spent 15 years studying anthelmintic resistance in small ruminants and cattle across the southern and midwestern United States. Dr. Hennessy was not dramatic about what she knew. She was methodical and precise, and she presented data the way a good carpenter presents a level. Here is the line, and here's where your wall is, and you can argue with me or you can look at the bubble. What she showed her students that semester was this: that the 3 major drug classes used for cattle deworming, the benzimidazoles, the macrocyclic lactones, and the levamisoles, were all experiencing measurable resistance gains in cattle parasite populations across the Midwest, and that the primary driver of that resistance was the same across every county and every farm. Calendar-based deworming without fecal egg count monitoring, applied to every animal in the herd regardless of individual parasite burden. Ingrid sat in that classroom and felt something she would later describe as a specific kind of cold. Not fear exactly, recognition. She had watched her father run a drench gun down the throat of every calf that came through the chute, spring and fall, for as long as she could remember, and she had never once thought to ask whether it was working. She had never thought to ask because nobody asked. The calves gained weight. The calves sold. The floor was solid. Dr. Hennessy introduced her students to a concept called Targeted Selective Treatment, or TST, which was the practice of using fecal egg counts to identify the specific animals in a herd carrying the highest parasite loads and treating only those animals, rather than treating the entire herd on a schedule. The logic was not complicated. In any given cattle population, roughly 20 to 30% of animals carry 80% of the parasite burden. If you treat only those animals, you accomplish two things simultaneously. You reduce the selection pressure on the parasite population, which slows resistance development, and you preserve what researchers call refugia, a population of parasites that have never been exposed to the drug and therefore carry no resistance genes. Those susceptible parasites dilute the resistant ones in the next generation. You are, in effect, using the biology of the parasite against itself. Ingrid also learned about a practice that had been studied extensively in New Zealand and Australia, and was beginning to generate data in the American South. The use of chickens as a biological control agent for cattle parasites. The mechanism was straightforward. The larvae of the most economically significant cattle gutworms, Ostertagia ostertagi, Couparia oncophora, Haemonchus place, live in the top inch of pasture grass, waiting to be ingested by a grazing host. Chickens, following behind cattle, scratch through that top layer of grass and soil and consume those larvae as part of their natural foraging behavior. They also consume the dung beetle larvae and fly larvae and fresh cattle manure, which disrupts the parasite life cycle at a second point. A 2014 field trial at the University of Georgia had shown a 35 to 48% reduction in infective larval populations on pastures where laying hens followed cattle by 72 hours compared to control pastures. A follow-up study in 2017 had replicated the finding in a Missouri climate analog. Ingrid had read both papers. She had read them more than once. She came home for Christmas in her junior year with a notebook full of data and a plan she had been working on since October. She waited until the second evening, after dinner, when her father was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the quiet that follows a good meal. She laid the notebook on the table and she told him what she wanted to do. She wanted to run 200 laying hens behind the cattle on a 72-hour rotation, moving them in a portable electric fenced unit from paddock to paddock. She wanted to implement a fecal egg count monitoring program and shift to targeted selective treatment, treating only the animals above a threshold of 200 eggs per gram. She wanted to track the data for 3 years and compare their parasite burden and drug use against their own historical baseline. The kitchen went quiet. Her younger brother stopped chewing. Her mother, Karen, set down her fork and looked at Eric with an expression that was not quite a smile. Eric Lindgren looked at the notebook for a long moment. He was 58 years old and had farmed this land for 35 years and had not lost money in the last 12 of them. He picked up the notebook. He read for a while. He set it back down. He said, "I need to think about it." He did not say no, but the way he said it, with the particular flatness that Eric Lindgren used when he was not ready to say yes, it sounded like no enough. Karen waited until Eric had gone to the living room. Then she looked at Ingrid and said quietly, "The numbers in that notebook are real." It was not a question. Ingrid said yes. Karin nodded once and said, "Then show him the numbers again in the spring. He listens better when the ground is thawing." It was the most strategic piece of advice anyone gave Ingrid Lindgren in the entire course of this story. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his laugh meant. Dale Crowley was 62 years old and had been the Saline County Extension Agent for livestock for 19 years. Before that, he had run his own cow-calf operation outside of Slater for 11 years, and before that, he had worked as a sales representative for a regional veterinary supply company, which was where he had developed his opinions about cattle health management and the confidence to share them with anyone who stood still long enough to listen. He was not a cruel man. He was not even a dishonest man. He was a man who had seen a great many young people come back from agricultural colleges with ideas that didn't survive contact with the Missouri winter, and that experience had calcified into a reflex that he mistook for wisdom. He held court at the Saline County Cooperative on Tuesday mornings, when the producers came in for coffee and conversation, and his opinions carried the weight that comes from longevity and certainty, and the fact that nobody had successfully contradicted him in recent memory. Ingrid came back in April of 2019 after graduation and moved into the farmhouse and began working the operation full-time. She had spent the spring semester finishing her degree and refining her proposal, and she had added to the notebook a cost analysis, a paddock rotation map, a fecal egg count protocol sourced from the American Association of Veterinary Parasitologists, and a 5-year revenue projection that compared their current deworming cost against the projected cost of TST management with a 40% reduction in treatment frequency. The numbers were not ambiguous. The numbers were, in fact, the clearest thing in the notebook. She presented the revised plan to her father on a Sunday evening in late April. He read the notebook again, more slowly this time. He asked 3 questions. Where would the chickens winter? What happened to the rotation if a paddock got wet? What did the vet think? Ingrid had answers to all 3. He looked at the paddock map for a while. Then he said, "Plant your 100 acres on the south pasture, the block below the tree line. We'll see how it goes." It was not enthusiasm, but it was permission, and permission was enough. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a person try to share a genuinely important idea in a room where the room has already decided? Where the decision was made before the words started, because the person speaking was the wrong age or the wrong gender, or simply the wrong kind of familiar. Because what happened next at the Saline County Cooperative on a Tuesday morning in May of 2019 was not an argument. It was not even a debate. It was a laugh. And the laugh is the part of this story that matters almost as much as what came after it. Ingrid had stopped in for a bag of mineral supplement and made the mistake, or perhaps the deliberate choice, of mentioning to the group at the counter what she was planning to do on the south pasture. She explained the fecal egg count protocol. She explained the targeted selective treatment threshold. She mentioned the chickens. She kept it brief and factual, the way she had learned to present things from Dr. Hennessy. Dale Crowley listened with the particular expression of a man who has heard a lot of things and found most of them wanting. When she finished, the silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale started laughing. It was not a mean laugh, which almost made it worse. It was a patient laugh, the laugh of a man who feels he is doing you a favor by not taking you seriously, because taking you seriously would require him to explain at length why you were wrong, and he was being merciful by skipping that part. "Chickens," he said. "You're going to run chickens behind your daddy's cattle." He looked at the men around the counter. A few of them smiled. One of them, a producer named Wes Hartwell, who ran 800 head outside of Malta Bend, actually shook his head. Dale said, "Ingrid, I've been watching cattle operations in this county for 20 years. I've seen a lot of ideas come through here. The ones that work, they work because they're simple and they're proven. You want to deworm your cattle? You deworm your cattle? That's what the chute's for." He paused. "Chickens," he said again, as if the word itself was the punchline. What that laugh was protecting, the narrator will tell you plainly, was not knowledge. It was not even experience exactly. It was the enormous comfort of a world that doesn't require you to update your understanding of it. Dale Crowley had spent 19 years telling Saline County producers how to manage their cattle health, and the advice had been adequate, which is a different thing from optimal, and he had never been required to know the difference. The laugh was the sound of a man who had never been shown the bubble on the level, and had therefore never had to admit his wall was crooked. Ingrid drove home. She did not say much about it. Her mother asked how the co-op went, and she said fine. She went out to the south pasture and walked the paddock lines she had already flagged with survey stakes, and she counted the stakes, and she went back to the barn and started building the first portable chicken unit out of cattle panels and hardware cloth and a used livestock trailer she had bought for $400 at an auction in Slater. Let me tell you about the summer of 2019, because it is where the data begins, and the data is the spine of this story. Ingrid started with 200 Isa Brown laying hens, a breed selected for high egg production and active foraging behavior. She divided the south pasture into 12 paddocks of roughly 8 acres each, and she moved the cattle through on a 10-day rotation and the chickens behind them on a 72-hour lag. The chickens were in a portable unit, 2 panels of electric netting, a shade structure, feeders, waterers, and a small laying box trailer that she moved by hand every 3 days. It took her about 40 minutes per move. She collected fecal samples from 20% of the cattle herd on a rotating basis every 28 days and sent them to a diagnostic lab in Columbia for egg counts. She kept a spreadsheet that tracked every animal's egg count history, every treatment event, and the drug used. The first fecal results came back in June. Of the 47 animals sampled, 11 were above the 200 eggs per gram treatment threshold. That was 23% of the sampled animals. In a conventional program, all 47 would have been treated. She treated 11. She recorded the drug, the dose, and the date. She noted which animals were chronic high shedders and flagged them for more frequent monitoring. She did not tell anyone at the co-op what the numbers said. She just kept moving the chickens. Her father watched all of this from a careful distance. He was not hostile. He was not converted. He was the thing that Eric Lindgren had always been, a man waiting to see whether the floor was solid. He checked the cattle every morning the way he always had, looking at their coats and their eyes and the way they carried themselves, and he did not say much. In July, he walked the paddocks with Ingrid after the chickens had moved through, and he looked at the pasture surface and he said, "Ground looks clean." It was not praise, but it was observation, and from Eric Lindgren, observation was the precursor to everything. The first year's numbers came in at the October weigh-in. The south pasture calves, the 100 acres under the new protocol, averaged 2.31 pounds of gain per day over the grazing season, compared to a 5-year farm average of 2.18 pounds per day on conventionally managed pasture. The treatment rate on the south pasture had been 24% of animals, compared to 100% on the conventionally managed north pasture. Drug cost on the south pasture was $3.40 per head. Drug cost on the north pasture was $14.20 per head. The egg production from 200 hens averaged 148 eggs per day through the laying season, which Ingrid sold at $3.50 per dozen to a grocery cooperative in Marshall and 2 restaurants in Kansas City that were willing to pay for pasture-raised eggs with documented rotational management. The egg revenue for the season was $11,847. She showed her father the spreadsheet at the kitchen table in November. He looked at it for a long time. He did not say much, but the next morning he told her that in the spring she could expand to the north pasture. Let me tell you about what Dale Crowley said that winter at the co-op, because Ingrid heard about it secondhand from Wes Hartwell's wife, who had no particular stake in the outcome and was therefore reliable. Dale had told the Tuesday Morning group that the Lindgren girls' numbers were probably fine for 1 year on a small block of ground, but that 1 year didn't mean anything, that any pasture could look good for 1 year, and that the real test would be whether the parasite pressure came back in year 2 when the novelty wore off and the management got sloppy. He said this with the confidence of a man who had already decided what the answer was going to be. He was not entirely wrong that 1 year was insufficient data. He was entirely wrong about everything else. Year 2, 2020, was the year the protocol expanded to the full 1,040-acre operation. Ingrid now ran 500 laying hens in 3 separate mobile units, rotating behind 3 separate cattle groups across the full pasture system. She had refined the rotation timing based on the first year's larval sampling data. She had added pasture larval counts to her monitoring protocol, scraping grass samples from paddocks at 24, 48, and 72 hours post-cattle departure to identify the optimal chicken follow window. The data showed that larval populations peaked at 48 to 72 hours after cattle left a paddock, which confirmed the research she had read, but also showed a farm-specific pattern. In the heavy clay paddocks near the tree line, the peak was closer to 60 hours, and she adjusted the chicken timing accordingly. The fecal egg count data from year 2 showed something that made her sit very still at her desk for a while when she read it. The mean egg count per gram across the herd had dropped 31% from the year 1 baseline. The percentage of animals above the treatment threshold had dropped from 23% to 17%. She was treating fewer animals, with fewer drugs, and the parasite burden was going down. Not because she had overwhelmed the parasite population with chemistry, but because she had disrupted its life cycle at the pasture level while simultaneously reducing the selection pressure that drove resistance. The refugia were working. The biology was working. The notebook was working. The egg revenue in year 2 was $31,200 from 500 hens, at a combined average of $3.65 per dozen across all buyers. 3 new restaurant accounts in Kansas City had contacted her after seeing the farm listed on a regional pasture-raised egg directory. She had also begun selling directly at the Saline County Farmers Market on Saturday mornings, where she sold out every week by 10 o'clock. Her total drug cost for the year was $4.10 per head across the full herd, compared to an estimated $14.20 per head under the previous protocol. On a 240-head stocker operation, that was a difference of $2,424 in drug costs alone, before accounting for the avoided resistance acceleration. Wes Hartwell drove past the south pasture twice that summer. Ingrid noticed his truck slow down both times. She did not say anything about it. She kept moving the chickens. Let me tell you about the science one more time, because by the fall of 2020, it had become impossible to separate the science from the story. The reason anthelmintic resistance matters to a cattle producer is not abstract. It is very concrete, and it has a dollar amount. When the drugs stop working, and in the American South in small ruminants, they have largely stopped working for the macrocyclic lactone class, which includes ivermectin. The cost is not just the wasted drug. The cost is the weight gain you don't see, the animals that don't thrive, the culls that come earlier, the replacement animals that cost more than the ones you lost. A 2018 study published in the Veterinary Parasitology Journal estimated that subclinical parasitism in cattle, meaning parasite loads high enough to suppress performance but not high enough to cause visible illness, costs American beef producers between $2 billion and $3 billion annually in suppressed gains and increased drug expenditure. The producers paying that cost mostly didn't know they were paying it because the cattle looked fine and the cattle sold and the floor felt solid. What Ingrid was doing was not complicated in principle. She was using chickens to reduce larval contamination on pasture, using fecal egg counts to identify which animals actually needed treatment, using targeted treatment to slow resistance development, and using the egg revenue to offset the management cost. The four pieces fit together the way good engineering fits together, each element supporting the others, the whole stronger than the sum of the parts. The sophistication was not in the concept, it was in the execution, and in the willingness to measure everything and let the numbers tell the truth. Now let me tell you about the summer of 2021, because the summer of 2021 was when the floor stopped feeling solid for a lot of people in Saline County. The spring had been wet, wetter than anyone in the county could remember since 2008. The Missouri River bottoms flooded in March and didn't fully drain until May, and the standing water sat on the low pastures and created the conditions that cattle parasitologists describe as ideal for larval development. Warm, moist, protected from desiccation. Ostertagi larvae, which are the primary economic parasite in Midwestern stocker operations, can survive on pasture for up to 6 months under the right conditions, and the spring of 2021 gave them the right conditions in abundance. By June, producers across the county were pulling calves off pasture that looked wrong. Rough coats, scouring, bottled jaws in the worst cases, all of it pointing to parasite overload. The calves that were supposed to be gaining 2 pounds a day were gaining 1 1/4, 1 1/2 at best. The producers did what they had always done. They ran them through the chute and gave them ivermectin. And the ivermectin didn't work. Not entirely, not completely. But the fecal egg count reductions that the drug was supposed to produce, the 90 to 95% reduction that is the benchmark for efficacy, were coming back at 60%, 55%, in 2 operations at less than 50%. The parasites were still there. The producers dewormed again. The calves still looked rough. By August, there were 3 operations in Saline County that had pulled their stocker calves early and sold them light, taking a loss on the season because they couldn't get the parasite pressure under control. Wes Hartwell was one of them. He pulled 140 head in August and sold them at a 38-pound average deficit below his target weight. At the prices that fall, that was roughly $47 per head. On 140 head, that was $6,580 left on the table, before you counted the drug cost of 2 full herd treatments that hadn't solved the problem. Dale Crowley told the Tuesday Morning Group that it was the wet spring. He said the conditions had been exceptional, and that the resistance numbers would normalize when the weather normalized. He said this with somewhat less certainty than he usually said things, and the men at the counter noticed, even if they didn't say so. Let me tell you about what the Lindgren South pasture looked like in August of 2021, because the contrast was not subtle. The stocker calves on the rotational system with the chicken follow were averaging 2.38 pounds a gain per day for the season. The mean fecal egg count across the herd was 94 eggs per gram, down 44% from the farm's pre-protocol baseline. The treatment rate for the season was 19% of animals. Ingrid had treated 46 head out of 243 on the full operation. She had used 3 drug classes in rotation, guided by fecal egg count reduction tests she ran on a subset of treated animals to monitor efficacy. She knew exactly which drugs were working and at what level of efficacy because she had measured it. The chickens were laying. The grass was clean. The calves were gaining. The floor was solid, and she had built it herself. Measurement by measurement, season by season, from a notebook she had started in a classroom in Columbia when she was 20 years old. Her father walked the south pasture with her in late August. He looked at the calves for a long time. He looked at the pasture surface. He said, "What's your egg count running?" She told him. He nodded. He said, "What are you planning for the North Block rotation next year?" She started to explain. He listened for a moment, and then he said, "You decide the rotation." He said it quietly, the way Eric Lindgren said everything, but Ingrid heard what was underneath it. It was not just permission. It was transfer. It was the thing that farmers mean when they stop telling you what to do and start asking what you're planning. It was trust, earned through 3 seasons of numbers that did not lie. Karin Lindgren, who had been listening from the porch, went inside without saying anything. But when Ingrid came in for supper, there was a glass of iced tea on the table next to her chair, which was not a thing that happened every day, and which meant something. Let me tell you about the October weigh-in of 2021, because the numbers are the verdict and the verdict should be stated plainly. The Lindgren operation sold 243 stocker calves at an average of 647 pounds, against a target of 640. Average daily gain for the season was 2.38 pounds. Drug cost per head was $4.30. Egg revenue for the season was $44,800 from 500 hens at a blended price of $3.80 per dozen. Now selling through 4 restaurant accounts, the farmers market, and a new arrangement with a Kansas City food distributor who had contacted Ingrid after seeing her operation profiled in a regional agricultural newsletter. Total parasite management cost, including egg count testing, drug cost, and chicken feed, was $6.10 per head. Under the old protocol, that number would have been $14.20 per head in drug cost alone, not counting the suppressed gain from subclinical parasitism that the old protocol hadn't been measuring. Wes Hartwell's operation, 800 head on a conventional program, had averaged 1.89 pounds of daily gain for the season. Drug cost per head had been $28.40, counting the 2 full herd treatments that had not resolved the resistance problem. He had sold 140 head early at a significant loss. His total parasite-related cost for the season, counting drug expenditure, suppressed gain, and early sale discount, was somewhere north of $34,000 by his own reckoning, which he shared with nobody except his wife and, eventually, Ingrid Lindgren. Dale Crowley did not come to the October weigh-in. He sent his assistant. Let me tell you about the morning Dale Crowley drove out to the Lindgren farm, because it is the scene this story has been building toward since a Tuesday morning in May of 2019, when a man laughed at the word chickens. It was a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after the weigh-in. The leaves were down, and the fields were brown, and the sky was the particular flat gray of a Missouri November that feels like it has been there forever and will be there until April. Dale pulled into the Lindgren yard in his county extension truck and sat in it for a moment before he got out, which Ingrid noticed from the barn window. He was 64 years old, and he had the look of a man who had rehearsed something on the drive over and was not entirely sure it was going to come out right. Ingrid came out of the barn. She was wearing a Carhartt jacket and a seed cap, and her boots had the particular kind of mud on them that comes from moving chicken units in wet grass, and she looked, in that moment, exactly like every other farmer in Saline County, which was a thing that had taken 3 years of work and was not accidental. Dale got out of the truck. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." He looked at the portable chicken units in the near paddock, and he looked at the cattle in the far paddock, and he said, "I've been looking at the numbers from this season." He said it carefully, the way a man says something he's been thinking about for a while. "The numbers from your operation." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to walk me through your protocol." Ingrid looked at him for a moment. She said, "I think you told me, back in 2019, that what I needed was a chute and a drench gun." She said it without heat. She said it the way you say a true thing, which is quietly and without decoration. Dale looked at the ground. He said, "I did say that." He said, "I was working with what I knew at the time." It was not an apology, exactly, but it was the closest Dale Crowley had come to one in 19 years of extension work, and the men who heard about it later, which was eventually most of the county, understood that it cost him something. Ingrid walked him through the protocol for 2 hours. She showed him the spreadsheet, the fecal egg count records, the treatment history, the larval sampling data, the paddock rotation maps. She showed him the efficacy testing results for each drug class and explained what the numbers meant for resistance management. She explained the refugia concept and the biology of targeted selective treatment. She showed him the egg revenue records and the per-head cost comparison. Dale asked questions. Good questions eventually, once he got past the ones he had asked to seem like he already knew the answers. He took notes. He stayed for coffee. He asked if he could share the protocol with other producers in the county. Ingrid said yes. She said, "The lesson isn't that chickens are magic. The lesson is that any operation that never measures its parasite burden is an operation that doesn't know whether its drugs are working, and any operation that doesn't know whether its drugs are working is one bad spring away from finding out they don't." Dale wrote that down. Let me tell you about what happened in Saline County over the next 4 years, because the story doesn't end with one farm or one season. By the spring of 2022, Dale Crowley had organized a county-wide fecal egg count monitoring workshop, co-presented with Dr. Carol Hennessy from the University of Missouri, who drove up from Columbia on a cold February morning to talk to 34 cattle producers in the Saline County Extension office. Ingrid sat in the second row. Her father sat beside her. It was the first extension meeting Eric Lindgren had attended in 11 years. He sat with his arms crossed for the first 20 minutes, and then he uncrossed them and leaned forward slightly, which was, for Eric Lindgren, the equivalent of a standing ovation. By the end of 2022, 7 operations in Saline County had implemented fecal egg count monitoring programs. 3 of them had added chicken follow systems of varying scales. Wes Hartwell was one of them. He started with 150 hens on 200 acres and called Ingrid in April to ask about portable unit construction. She drove out and spent a Saturday helping him build the first unit. She did not charge him for it. She brought lunch. By 2023, the number of county operations using some form of targeted selective treatment had grown to 14. The Saline County Cooperative had begun stocking fecal egg count sampling supplies at the counter next to the mineral supplements, which was a change that Dale Crowley had personally requested. The Tuesday morning group at the co-op had begun to include conversations about egg counts and drug efficacy and refugia management, which were not the kinds of conversations that had happened there before, and which meant that the floor had shifted, even if nobody said so directly. Ingrid was asked to present at the Missouri Cattlemen's Association annual meeting in January of 2023. She drove to Columbia with a folder of data and a laptop and stood at a podium in front of 200 cattle producers and extension agents and veterinarians and told them what she had found, in the same plain, factual way that Dr. Hennessy had taught her. She showed the egg count data. She showed the drug cost comparison. She showed the resistance efficacy numbers from 2021. She showed the egg revenue figures. She showed the per-head cost comparison across 4 seasons. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted about 3 seconds, which in a room of 200 people is a very long silence, and then a man in the back row started clapping and the room followed. Eric Lindgren was sitting in the 4th row. He had driven to Columbia alone without telling Ingrid he was coming, and she had not seen him when she walked in. She saw him when the applause started. He was not clapping. He was sitting very still with his hands on his knees and his jaw set in the particular way that Eric Lindgren's jaw set when he was feeling something he was not going to say out loud. But his eyes were bright, and that was enough. Let me tell you about the spring of 2024, because the story has one more turn. Ingrid was in the barn on a Saturday morning in March, repairing a section of electric netting that had taken damage from a deer when her daughter, Maya, who was 4 years old and had been following her mother around the farm since she could walk, came in with a question. Maya had been watching the chickens move through the paddock from the fence, the way Ingrid had watched the cattle move when she was small, learning the rhythms of the land by living inside them. She asked her mother why the chickens always went where the cows had been. Ingrid explained it to her, simply, the way you explain things to a 4-year-old. The chickens eat the bad bugs that make the cows sick, so the cows stay healthy. Maya thought about this for a moment and then said, "What if the cows ate the bad bugs too?" Ingrid looked at her daughter for a moment. She said, "What do you mean?" Maya said, "What if we put something in the field that the cows eat that makes the bad bugs not want to be there?" She was 4 years old and she did not have the vocabulary for what she was describing. But what she was describing, in the loose and imprecise language of a child who had grown up watching her mother measure things, was something close to the concept of bioactive forages. Plants like chicory, bird's foot trefoil, and sainfoin that contain condensed tannins with documented anthelmintic properties, and which had been the subject of a growing body of research in New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and, more recently, in a handful of American university trials. Ingrid had read some of that research. She had a folder on her laptop. She had not done anything with it yet, partly because the farm was already running well, and partly because she had learned, from watching her father, that there is a right time to propose a new idea and a wrong time, and the wrong time is before the current idea has finished proving itself. She looked at her daughter and she said, "That's a really good question." She said it the way Dr. Hennessy had said things, which was without condescension and without false praise, just the plain acknowledgement of a true thing. She said, "Let's look into it." She went to the barn shelf where she kept her research folders, and she pulled out the one labeled Bioactive Forages, and she handed it to Maya, who could not read it but held it with both hands the way children hold things that feel important. Then Ingrid went back to repairing the electric netting, and the chickens moved through the paddock in the early spring light, and the farm kept working the way it had learned to work, by measuring and adjusting, and listening to whoever was paying attention. Let me tell you one last thing, because this story does not belong only to Saline County, or to one farm, or to one season's worth of numbers. It belongs to the question of who gets listened to and when, and what it costs a community to wait until a crisis before it finds out that the floor was crooked. Dale Crowley is still the Saline County Extension Agent. He is a better one than he was in 2019, not because he became a different person, but because someone showed him the bubble on the level and he looked at it. Wes Hartwell's operation is running 200 laying hens behind his stocker cattle, and his drug costs are down 61% from his 2021 peak. 14 operations in the county are using fecal egg count monitoring. 3 of them have started selling pasture-raised eggs. The Saline County Cooperative has a small laminated card at the counter with the AAVP treatment threshold guidelines and a QR code that links to a fecal sampling protocol that Ingrid wrote and that Dale Crowley laminated. Eric Lindgren retired from day-to-day operations in the fall of 2023. He still walks the pastures every morning. He still checks the cattle the same way he always has, looking at their coats and their eyes and the way they carry themselves. But now he also looks at the chicken units, and he checks the water, and sometimes he moves a paddock flag that has leaned in the wind. He does not say much about it. He does not have to. Ingrid Lindgren still farms the same 1,040 acres southeast of Marshall. She runs 500 laying hens, 3 mobile units, a full fecal monitoring program, and a spreadsheet that now has 5 years of data in it, which is long enough to be a story and short enough to still be a beginning. She has a folder on her laptop labeled Bioactive Forages and a daughter who asks good questions. She planted chickens in a cattle county. They laughed. The wet spring came. The drugs stopped working. The other fields went pale. Hers kept growing.